morning, everyone. You're watching So a Neighbor Asked, a monthly webinar that provide Mountain States Legal Foundation, where our attorneys answer your questions about the Constitution, the law, and liberty. And I'm your host today, Karina Constancio. I'm a marketing associate here at Mountain States Legal Foundation, and I'm joined by our longtime attorney, David.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for having me, Karina. And I have the pleasure to introduce our guest today. Our guest is Denny Rehberg, a longtime friend of the foundation, alongside his wife Jan, who serves on our board and has for many years. Denny's a former rancher and an entrepreneur who served in the Montana. I am state dyslexic this morning, apparently. Montana state legislature for 3 terms before serving as the lieutenant governor for 6 years, and then finally a long stint in Congress where he was one of the greatest defenders of property rights and limited government in Capitol Hill. And we are delighted and honored to invite him here today to speak with us about the Declaration. So welcome, Danny.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. And I can't say enough about Mountain States Legal Foundation. What you do is really important to the whole process. So you're part of a coalition to protect our rights. And I thank you all for that.
Well, we appreciate that. I mean, we couldn't be able to do what we do without the support of you and your wife and all the people like you guys. So thank you.
Good news, I'm not an attorney, so I chose a different route. But I certainly respect the legal profession and all of you attorneys that are at Mountain States. We couldn't do it without you, and that's part of our Constitution and how this all came about. A strong judiciary. So
yeah,
you do good.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we're so glad to have you on today. We have a question to start us out, and that's a neighbor asked, is the Declaration of Independence relevant today?
Absolutely. There's no doubt. And if you think about it, I'll go back in history a little bit. There was a committee of 5 that established the first draft. And the 3 names you'll recognize most are Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And they kind of fought. They didn't necessarily get along, and John Adams didn't want to be the one who wrote the first draft because he said people don't like me, and he said, Thomas Jefferson, you're a better writer and people like you. And so they crafted it. Jefferson wrote it in essentially one day. It took him 15, but he only really wrote it in one day. But it's relevant. I always have a hard time with relevancy. It still matters. Let's put it that way, because it was based on some fundamental foundations, and the foundations were based upon early teachings. I mean, Jefferson was really a student, and he understood the Bible. He understood the Israelites. He understood Anglo-Saxon, and he really based the entire Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, and the Founding Fathers looked heavily on ancient principles, and they still matter. The problem is there's cracks in that right now, and that's what you guys do best. Is you try and close those cracks.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail right on the head there. You said that these are kind of universal principles that stand the age of time. That these would have made sense to the apostles as much as they make sense to us now in 2023. And it did. These rights that we talk about, the right to property, the right that all men are created equal, all that. They're inalienable, but they're not just inalienable. They're fundamental. They're universal. They long predate any institution of government whatsoever.
Absolutely.
And those are unchanging going
forward. And the difficulty is we kind of misinterpret sometimes the Constitution because there's vested rights, and that's what I'm involved in, the legal process. You know, I was in the executive branch and I served in the legislative branch, and I clearly understand that anything that the legislature, the Congress, the presidency, they're just dabbling around the vested rights, and they argue about it. We argue about it. It's what you hear in the press, but it all goes back down to the basic fundamentals of the Constitution, which really was based upon freedom, both individual and as a country, prosperity as individuals and as a country, and peace. Those are the things that mankind wants, or womankind, or us kind, or whatever you want to call it now. The rest of that debate is all about vested, but it's really important to stay focused on the Constitution. They wrote it so it could be not necessarily a living document, but at least flexible enough that it would meet any generation. And this generation is kind of messing it up right this minute.
Yeah, I kind of like the, I think it's a quote from J.R.R. Tolkien. He's very angry at people saying that taking new meanings to its books, allegory for something. He said, not an allegory, but applicability is something I really prefer for that term. I think that applies to the Constitution and the Declaration. The meaning is fixed, it stays the same, but it's applicable to innumerable new circumstances. That's I think the genius work that universal.
Absolutely.
Well, and they also clearly understood the checks and balances. You know, and real quick story. As I traveled, I was on foreign operations appropriations, so that's foreign and state government, and I traveled around the world. And what I noticed in places like Africa is everybody wanted to be like America because they see our prosperity, they see our freedom, but they never wanted to do exactly what we did, and that was set up a separate judiciary. They always wanted a judiciary under the authority of the executive. And then they also got three-termitis. They always said 2 terms for their president, but they went once they finished their 2 terms, they wanted more. So everybody looks to America, our Declaration of Independence, the things we stand for, but they never really want to do it. They set up some other form, whether it's parliament or whatever, but they don't separate the judiciary, and they don't have the checks and balances. And as a result, they don't have the ability to have what America has.
Absolutely. Yeah. Can you kind of give us a very brief, very simple kind of overview of what the Declaration of Independence is?
Well, it really was a statement, and it began the process of the making of America. This didn't happen in 1776. There was a lot of thought that was put in ahead of time, and that's when I go back to, you know, Jefferson and his study, and Franklin was no idiot as well, and John Adams. They spent a lot of time thinking about independence and what it stood for, and the freedoms that we wanted, and it was really an experiment. So what the Declaration of Independence was, it was a statement essentially, and there was a lot of argument. They didn't necessarily get along or agree, but they all came together at the end. They all wanted the same thing in the end, but there was a lot of fights. And that's what we're seeing in America today, is the same kind of argument and fight, and the pendulum and the extreme right and the extreme left, and trying to come to a reasonable solution. But the Declaration of Independence was the first swipe at saying, look, we want a new experiment. We want to do something that's never been done before. We'll do comparative analysis of all these others, the Anglo-Saxons and the Israelites, but we want our own, and we want to write it. We want to sit down and we want to debate it. And that's why they made the Constitution so hard to change, because you can have an amendment to the Constitution, but you're going to have a lot of debate and a lot of argument. I just signed up this last week with Newt Gingrich and Mick Mulvaney and a whole bunch of other people to help try and move a constitutional amendment through the Montana legislature calling for a balanced budget. Do we think we're going to get enough states to have a constitutional convention? No, but we begin the argument of, do we need to balance the budget? Because if we don't do something like that, we're going to lose that independence that the Declaration of Independence established in the first place. That's probably my biggest fear. We'll spend ourselves into an inability to have that independence as the framers of the Declaration of Independence wanted.
Yeah, 100%. Like it's, I think this big issue is that this independence issue is it's easy to assume independence means merely physical. This idea that, oh, we're separated by 3,000 miles. We declared that no more redcoats. We're done. We're independent now.
Yeah.
But if you look at like a lot of the list of grievances, when they're talking about the reason why they need independence, they're talking about the king has risen up judges who were not independent. The king has removed our ability to assent to our own laws. The king has set in his own officers amongst us. Like these all sound like pretty modern complaints to me. These all sound like administrative state complaints, federal overreach complaints. So I think you can see these kind of through lines throughout, and it's why it's so important for us to keep in mind this sense of what the Declaration is about independence, and not just independence from some foreign sovereign power. It's independence from arbitrary authority from this horrible bonds of despotism, which gripped humanity for the entirety of our history prior to this, essentially. So, yeah,
there's a couple of different ways you can look at it, and the two extremes are tyranny and anarchy, and we're kind of seeing some of that going on right now. Too much government, too little government, and so the tyranny is, and I don't want to name names, but when you have somebody at the top that's really driving messages that don't seem to make sense under our Constitution, and then you have the anarchy on the other side. They look the other way when there's a riot somewhere and there's property destruction. It's too much government, too little government, tyranny versus anarchy. And that's kind of what we're going through right now. And the good news is, pull out a dollar bill out of your pocket and you'll see a pyramid. And that pyramid isn't honoring Egypt. What the pyramid is supposed to be showing is that the people rule. And so it's up to us ultimately to take the authority back from the tyranny or the anarchy and bring some kind of balance back, one to our government and one to our society, the freedom, the prosperity, and all the things that we want. And that's why our founding fathers did such a great job with the Declaration of Independence and then ultimately the Constitution.
Yeah, it's ultimately up to us. I think
it is.
When the Declaration is saying we hold these truths to be self-evident. But no, we don't need a king or someone in an ermine robe to explain this to us. The salty that everyone can understand this. These are self-evident. Absolutely.
Well, and the one thing we have to remember, every square inch of America is represented by someone. We may not necessarily agree with the Bernie Sanders of the world, but his people elected him. He is a representative of his constituency. And I may not like it, but I have to accept it. And then we debate the issues, and hopefully we build coalitions enough that we can overcome some of the crazy socialist ideas that some of they come up with. But they would say the same about us. And so it's a checks and balance. It's a balance of power. And that's what our founding fathers were so really good at. And that's why we really need to study the Declaration, study the Constitution, apply it in our own lives, and then ultimately we'll have a better government.
Absolutely. I know, like David was saying earlier, the Declaration definitely highlights, the independence from the different grievances that the Americans had against the king and all of that. And those are still very much applicable to some of the grievances we have today. But do you think that you see or can highlight any maybe additional grievances that maybe you are seeing today?
Well, again, the grievances are basically the vested rights, which are either the executive branch trying to insert its influence over the issues of the day, or the Congress with the pendulum. When there's one party rule, we ended up with Obamacare. Well, we wouldn't have had Obamacare if it hadn't been a clear majority in the House, the Senate, and the presidency. But at that time, the people spoke. And then it took Senator Brown to win to change the makeup of the Senate. And I served in all kinds of legislatures. I was in a 50-50 split in the Montana legislature. The next session, we had the majority, but the Senate was split 25-25. And let's not kid ourselves. We don't all agree. And there are more than one party. And so that's a good thing. So the grievances are really based upon daily vested. And that's why it's good that we have a Supreme Court now that can rule on things that maybe the executive branch overstepped its bounds. Talk about Roe versus Wade. Maybe the Congress oversteps its bound. The initial seal of the United States, interestingly, was an eagle with two heads, House and Senate, then the judiciary and the executive. Now, they didn't accept that. If you look at our seal, the eagle doesn't have two heads. But we have a very complicated Constitution, and the Declaration began the process. And we just have to continue to revisit that, and that's where the public dialogue comes in. Is there going to be a radical change in the next election? I don't know. Sometimes when you get a radical change, you get radical problems. Hence, things like Obamacare, which has created a lot of problems for us. But again, you go back to the fundamentals of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They've given us the framework. Shame on us if we don't take advantage of the debate the people taking over when we see something going wrong.
Yeah, and I would just want to add on to that. We're talking about modern grievances, the version of that. And I think the biggest example that I would see that we're dealing with today that reminds me of the stuff they're talking about in the Declaration is this ever expanding power of the administrators. I'm sure for those of you who've seen multiple webinars that I've been on, they sound like a broken record on this. But I think that there's very similar. I think the Professor Philip Hamburger at Columbia has a book about how the administrative state is essentially the child of the Star Chamber from England, and I think that that's 100% correct. And this we've lost so much of our self-governance, so much of that independence because we've abdicated or allowed Congress to abdicate on our behalf of these responsibilities of self-government that go along with those rights that we have. So that's as far as modern grievances go, that would be my big one.
Okay. Yeah. 100%.
Well, it always upset me as a legislator when the courts were making law. That was not intended to be their responsibility. They were supposed to adjudicate, and they didn't. And so I think now we have a Supreme Court that clearly understands that there has to be limited activity by the judiciary, not stepping on the toes of the executive and the legislative. And I clearly recognize that I wasn't particularly well suited for the executive because one, it moves too slowly. Two, I couldn't hardly work with bureaucrats because they get entrenched and you can't blast their mind once they've made up their mind, and they're not necessarily always with us. And so I like the ragtag of the legislative branch. But isn't that interesting? Because our founding fathers truly spent a lot of time to create something that's unique in the world, unique to humanity, has created these freedoms and the prosperity that we have that everybody wants, but they don't want to do what we did.
So that's something you raised. I'm very curious to ask about, because you just mentioned you've served in several different types of legislatures, and at times where it's been 50-50 splits. The Declaration is unanimous. There's 56 signatures that signed that. I don't think there was a single member of the convention that refused to sign. I could be wrong. That is shocking. I can't imagine Congress voting 100% on what to name a post office, let alone the most radical political document ever written at that time. So how is that possible? Do you get that kind of?
Well, just remember, there's a difference between 56 and 435.
Fair enough.
I was on one of the largest committees, and that's why I like Congress, because you build coalitions to create a majority, and it's not that easy. But if you look at the Declaration of Independence, they didn't start with all the signers. They started with 5 people, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and 2 asterisks. Nobody ever knows the other 2 poor guys. It's like it being an accident, the most famous person gets all the press for the accident. And that's kind of what happened there. But there were just 5 of them on that initial drafting. And like I said, Jefferson wrote it in a day. But he actually took 15 days only because he didn't want to look like he was the smartest guy on the block, but he really was at the time, because he had studied all the classics and he knew the Bible, and he knew Anglo-Saxons, and he knew the Israelites. He knew all of that stuff, as did Franklin and Adams, but he was able to articulate it in such a way that it's I don't want to say a living document, but it really is living, because it should still be with us.
Absolutely.
Now, if you ever want to serve on a big committee, 435 is really hard to maneuver. I mean, you got to give any of those guys that are in leadership credit for being able to bring forward a majority. And it isn't necessarily based upon Republicans, Democrats, and some independents. You got to have like-minded people that understand the issue. And it can be difficult sometimes.
Definitely. Compromise is not something I was invented for. I'm more of a grind my enemy into the dirt, which is probably why I became a litigator rather than a politician.
Well, that's why you'd be a judge. Maybe even
I wish,
maybe even a governor. But I remember when I served under 2 different governors, and the first governor came in and said, "I'm in charge state government, state employees. You're going to do as I say. And they went, you're gone in 4 years. We'll see that your life is as miserable as possible as we can make it. And he was gone in 4 years. That was it. And so, you know, you got to go along to get along sometimes as a governor with your own employees, whether you agree with them or not. And that's a problem. You need a strong governor that can control their state employees. But again, it comes from the people. It rises from the bottom up. And so the governor is just a reflection of a lot of people. The legislature could have controlled a lot of the things that the state employees did and chose not to. And so it's a checks and balance. It's a pendulum. It's a fabulous document, the Declaration and the Constitution. It just needs our paying attention to the issues of the day.
Yeah, and I think even just like the fact that the Declaration was signed unanimously, I think it speaks to the amount of unity and value that the founding fathers did place on the freedom and the independence that you know, they were fighting for.
Well,
so
showed their ability to rise up above it, because they were no less divided personally than we were. I'm sure there was plenty of them that absolutely hated each other.
Oh, for sure.
Well, they did.
They literally dueled each other.
Yeah.
So like that. But when you have these ideals, they were able to rise above and in this important moment and say that no, we're standing for something.
The stories about the fights that occurred, the verbal fights. And again, you got to remember when I said, you know, we represent every square inch. Now, of course, according to Obama, there's 54 states. So we have to kind of remind him there's only 50. Those are the things that catches your attention. But just remember, Congress is represented by rich and poor, men and women, educated and uneducated, lawyers, and the rest of us, good people. You know, so it's a combination, and that's exactly what the founding fathers were. That's the exactly what happened with the Declaration of Independence. Those people did not all come from the same background. Some came from Virginia, some came from Massachusetts. The Virginians didn't have the same opinion, and so it's interesting. You know, things like slavery. It was argued slavery long before 1776, and Jefferson tried to promote the ending of slavery. Well, look at how long it took to get there. And the truth be known, he even had slaves himself. And so those kinds of debates occurred during the Declaration of Independence. But when you say they all came together, they did in the end. They made the best argument. If the argument didn't pass, they moved on. They all signed it. But that doesn't mean they actually got along philosophically. But that's what's nice about the Declaration. It gives you the opportunity to argue your position, but ultimately you have to come to a conclusion of how best to govern yourself and govern the people that you represent.
It's the pursuit of happiness. There's no guarantees here.
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly. And
I like the prosperity part. You know, the more money we can make honestly, the better off we are. But peace too. I mean, that they really understand peace. We talk about faith, family, and freedom. If faith wasn't really in there, family wasn't really in there. We've kind of created that for ourselves, but it really was about prosperity and peace and freedom. That's really what the basis was, and that's what we have to remember and try and get back to.
Yeah, and since we're kind of talking, you know, about the founding fathers, and we know kind of the promise that they made, you know, to each other and to the nation, what do you think, or what do you see is our promise that we make today? How do we continue kind of that revolution? Yes.
Well, you know, again, it all boils down to the pendulum, and that is too much government or too little government, or what's right. You know, it's like the three bears. You got to come to something in between. You can't have too much, but you really have to have the basic government that the federal government only can do. It's you know, defense. One of the problems we have to be careful on is telling the truth to the public. I mean, We always talk about the Social Security Trust Fund. Well, there is no trust fund. There never was a trust fund because the problem was Congress started spending the money. So as you pay your taxes into Social Security, that doesn't mean it's all been put into a Social Security trust fund because Congress over the years has taken money out of it. So there isn't a trust fund. We have to be honest with ourselves. And so the entitlements, and I used to chair the Appropriations Subcommittee in Congress that had the most entitlements. I chaired the subcommittee on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and Obamacare. I had to somehow put the people in place to try and manage a diminishing trust fund. And so Medicare is getting hard to pay for, Medicaid is getting hard to pay for, Social Security, Obamacare. Those are the kinds of promises we've made to the next generation that aren't going to be there. And so we have to be honest with ourselves as politicians to tell the American public, look, we got problems coming up. And if you don't allow us the opportunity to address us without blaming us for pushing grandma off a cliff in their wheelchair, then you're going to pay the price in the future. So the best thing we could do for the next generation is be honest with them, try and explain the issues. Don't rush it. Don't put some kind of Social Security reform out there that doesn't have the public support. Build the support of the people and then move forward with the kind of reforms necessarily to give them the same kind of security that we have had, perhaps some not, in Social Security or Medicare or healthcare, Obamacare.
That's awesome.
We'll see. Well, it's easy to say, but we've divvied in the corners, and sometimes it's very difficult to paint our way back out of a corner that we've painted ourselves into. And we're headed for some really tough times, and that's why we all have to read the newspaper, listen to the news, watch your social media, pay attention to the issues of the day, and try and keep an open mind.
100%. Yeah. How do you see the principles of equality, natural rights, self-governance still being applicable to today?
Well, every generation has had more things that chip away at those three items. And, you know, I always kind of laugh about the fact that I'm fifth generation on the ranch, but I remember I grew up with my great-grandfather, and my great-grandfather had a dairy, and my dad was in the dairy business. My great-grandfather said, why aren't you able to establish the same prosperity that I did with my 200 milk cows? And my dad was perfect. He said, because you didn't have an income tax. You didn't have a government that took the money away that you created. And you're taking the money, your generation and the next generation, his father, my grandfather, started taxation at the federal level and started chipping away at the ability to have the same self-prosperity that prior generations had. So therein lies part of the problem. We're chipping away at the freedoms, the prosperities, and essentially we're kind of chipping away at peace as well. I mean, we're the most giving country in the world, no doubt about it. We help other countries, but sometimes we get wrapped up in things that don't make a lot of sense. And of course, I was a big supporter of Iraq and Afghanistan, and now we're debating Ukraine. We've always had big hearts, and we always try and help others help themselves. It doesn't always work out for us.
And I think it's important to remember that these are ideals rather than something that's ever necessarily been 100% realized in America. These have always been ideals. And especially at the beginning, especially on the matter of all men are created equal, we fell short of that for a very long time. I think it's important to recognize that while we fell short, it was still an ideal, and we were constantly pushing for, with some hiccups along the way, not to downplay it or anything, but there was a constant effort for it. And I think we have to remember that while all the issues that the past had, they were continuing to move forward. And we need to keep that spirit in mind.
Absolutely.
As we don't rest on our laurels, don't rest on the memory of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson.
Yep.
We continue to fight for all men are created equal, natural rights, property rights, all these things that we have to continue pushing forward
Mhm.
for them to improve them to reach the ideal.
Absolutely. I mean, that's
Well,
probably-
I can't speak. I can't speak to the judiciary, but I do know, my wife and I were high school sweethearts, so we went to college together, and she studied political science along beside me. So I know going into the judiciary and becoming an attorney, she had to learn the same basic foundation or fundamentals of what America stands for. I can't speak to law school because I was having a lot of fun when she was studying for in law school. But I know that the Mountain States clearly understands the Constitution and how it all fits in, and that's why I admire the work you do. I just don't want to do it myself. I want to watch it and observe it from a distance, and I can go ahead and complain about it not working out exactly the way I want. But one thing I have learned from my attorney wife is you don't win them all. Because I always say, can we sue them? Well, you may not win. What do you mean I can't win? I'm right. Well, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to win. And so, as you said, David, it is a goal. It's a vision. We really want things to turn out right, but we have to pay attention, and it's a constant battle. And that's what the Mountain States Legal Foundation does. It's kind of a conscience of right and wrong, and you're not going to win them all, but you're winning a lot of them, and you're winning some good ones.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Denny, for coming on and discussing and providing insights into the Declaration and the Constitution. We really appreciate your time. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for joining this month's So a Neighbor Asked. Thank you to David and once again to Denny for sharing their insights and having this conversation with us. Feel free to follow us on our social media pages. Just type in Mountain States Legal Foundation into Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube and LinkedIn. Thank you again for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time.